Washington, D.C.
Tonight, Guardians of the Strait. President Trump says the U.S. will hit Iran very hard tonight and tomorrow after reinstating a blockade on Iranian ships in the Strait of Hormuz and announcing a 20% levy on other cargo moving through the critical waterway. And Brent back above $80. Uncertainty overflows through the Strait of Hormuz spurred the biggest surge in oil prices since April and raised concerns about a prolonged disruption fueling inflation. Plus, remembering Lindsey Graham. The Senate is remembering longtime South Carolina Republican Lindsey Graham, who died suddenly at 71. More on his legacy and what his passing means for the future of the Senate.
He was a friend to so many of us on both sides of the aisle. And I know that I'm not the only one who finds it difficult to imagine the Senate without Lindsey Graham.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew.
And we begin with breaking news this evening. President Trump vowing to hit Iran, quote, very hard tonight and tomorrow, unquote. This comes after reports the Trump administration notified lawmakers over the weekend that the nation is once again at war with Iran. And from the White House's view, that would restart a 60-day clock for military action without congressional approval. The announcement following a weekend of strikes between the U.S. and Iran, the president now demanding a 20% reimbursement on all cargo shipped through the strait. Oil spiking today as a result. Let's start off with Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, who joins us live from the White House. He's on the North Lawn right now, and it sounds, Jeff, like we are back to war this evening. What can you tell us?
We absolutely are, Joe, and it's interesting for a couple different reasons. Number one, he's actually using the word war. Remember, there was a good chunk of time during this conflict when the Republicans didn't even want to call it a war. It certainly is one, and the United States is back in it. Number two, you're not hearing President Trump using the language of this is going to be short, this is going to go quickly. So there's no real timeline, which raises another question again of how long does this last? Is there and will there be an off-ramp? And then number three, it's interesting that he's coordinating with Congress a little bit, which is something that he was criticized the first time around when the U.S. Went into the war with Israel against Iran, that he did not do.
Well, and as we consider who he was notifying in Congress, one of Congress's more hawkish members, someone who was an advocate for this war from the very beginning, of course, is no longer with us. Senator Lindsey Graham passed this weekend, Jeff, at the age of 71. We got confirmation from the governor of his state, Governor McMaster in South Carolina, that his sister is going to be the one who takes his role on a temporary caretaker basis, as was announced this afternoon. Listen.
Lindsey took care of his little sister in years long departed. It's my honor to ask his little sister, Darlene Graham, to finish his work for him now.
Jeff, of course, Darlene also was the choice that President Trump suggested to the governor be made here. But this Lindsey Graham in particular was incredibly close to this president and to this White House and served as a liaison in many ways. What does his loss mean, not just for the Senate, but for this White House and this president?
Yeah, so a couple of things there, Kaylee. Certainly, number one, you're right to say that he was very close to the president. Interestingly so, because they didn't start that way. Lindsey Graham ran against Donald Trump for the presidential nomination in 2015, 2016, obviously lost, and initially did not have nice things to say about President Trump. Lindsey Graham had been a very strong ally and friend of John McCain, who also didn't get along very well with Trump. But all of that changed. Lindsey Graham coming around to the Trump presidency, both for the first term and the second term, and really becoming sort of the whisperer for the Trump administration in the Senate, which is not a voice that's going to be very easy to replicate, and that will be one thing that's tricky for this White House. I would say with regard to the appointment of his sister, that's something that will clearly please the president because, as you rightly said, that's something that he wanted. It almost certainly would have pleased Lindsey Graham because it means she will now have access to that camaraderie of senators and his legacy there for the last 6 months. And then also from a political standpoint, it means they've chosen someone who is not going to then automatically have sort of a political heads up when running for the permanent replacement to his seat.
All right, Bloomberg's Jeff Mason live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more on the conflict with Iran and the sudden death of Senator Lindsey Graham is Republican Senator Alan Armstrong of Oklahoma, who was appointed to fill the seat left open by now Homeland Security Secretary Mark Mourn. Senator, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. If we could begin with the shocking death of your colleague over the weekend. You, of course, were until, I guess, Lindsey Graham's sister joins you in the Senate, the most junior member. And I wonder, in the short time you were able to spend with one of the more senior members and the senior senator from South Carolina, what reflections you have on the man and colleague he was.
Yeah, you know, it was really an honor to get to work with Lindsey, and I was always struck by how pragmatic he was and what a strong voice he had particularly amongst the Republican caucus, but really across the Senate. I think people knew him for somebody that would speak his mind and was clear and convincing in his argument. And, you know, from my perspective, you know, he carried a lot of voice within the Senate, and it was a real pleasure and an honor, frankly, to get to serve with him.
Well, Senator, we appreciate your thoughts on that, and I'd like to advance the conversation by pointing our viewers and listeners to what was the final effort by Lindsey Graham, and that was to craft a Russia sanctions bill that he's been working on for months here. It does appear that the president today is going to back it. Some have suggested naming it for Lindsey Graham. Would you support that idea, and would you vote for this to approve it?
Yes, I would. I think he had, you know, again, a really strong perspective on that, and I do think that it's in our best interest to support Ukraine. It's impressive to me what that nation and the people of that nation have stood up to. And I think we've done a great job today, but I think we need to make sure that we don't leave them in any way unsupported in that conflict.
Well, and of course, that is one ongoing conflict. There is another that apparently, Senator, is in fact, once again, a war. As we got word today that the president formally notified Congress, you and your colleagues, that the war with Iran has resumed. Given your experience in the energy sector, I wonder what realistically you think this means for energy flows and therefore energy prices here at home.
Yeah, you know, I think it's pretty remarkable how well things have stood up here in the U.S. If you roll the clock back to 2022, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, we saw Brent crude oil prices over $120. You know, versus the 80 that they've risen back to now. Gasoline prices were $5.02 versus the $3.87 at a retail level that they were recently. So I actually think that that prices have held up pretty well.
But Senator, and apologies for interrupting, but was the market not reflecting an expectation that the war was going to be over, that we were pursuing negotiation and the Strait would be reopened? It seems that is no longer the circumstance we find ourselves in.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm just suggesting that, you know, even with it making really clear today, and we certainly saw some movement in oil prices today, but considering the fact the energy industry has always known how important the Strait of Hormuz and being able to get crude and natural gas both through that strait, how important those were, I think it's actually fairly impressive how stable prices have stayed here in the U.S. even through that conflict. And particularly if you think about natural gas and how fortunate we are here in the U.S. to have an abundance of natural gas and our ability to rely on that in the U.S., prices have actually gone down over time as that conflict. So I think we sometimes forget how fortunate we are to have an abundance of energy supplies here in the U.S.
Senator, we're just seeing breaking news on the terminal that it was at 4:45 p.m., a little more than 20 minutes ago, that the U.S. began a third night of strikes against Iran. This is happening now. CENTCOM posting on X that it is, in fact, underway as we speak. Our audience should know, Senator, that you actually know more about the energy space than probably most lawmakers here in Washington, considering your time as the chief at Williams Company, your time as well as a director at Constellation. And I'm curious your thoughts on, particularly with your experience at Williams, the extent to which you understand the way the pipeline business works. Could we be in a world in which we pipeline our way around the strait and leave it irrelevant?
Yeah, you know, and thank goodness there in those countries, we won't have to be dealing with some of the U.S. permitting that we have here, because if it was in the U.S., I wouldn't be very hopeful about our ability to pipeline around that. But yes, a lot of capabilities there in the Middle East, and they're not fraught with the permitting issues that we have here in the U.S. So yes, there's a lot of ability to bring the product around the strait, and I do think, you know, we're going to see some big action very quickly taken to build pipelines, because an abundance of infrastructure, even if the strait opened tomorrow, it would be, those pipelines would be beneficial as a form of defense against not having those pipelines there in the first place. Said another way, there's certainly nothing wrong with over-investing in infrastructure to make sure that you're not caught short-handed with ways of transporting precious commodities.
Well, and as we consider the transport of those commodities, the president today suggested that the U.S. is going to charge a 20% fee on any cargo that transits the Strait of Hormuz, even non-Iranian cargoes. Is that a wise course of action, Senator? I thought this was an international waterway, and therefore all fees or tolls were illegal. At least that was the case when Iran wanted to do it.
Yeah, I'm not ready to comment on that. I haven't seen the full details on that. And so certainly, you know, I think the president has been trying to gain other parties' support in helping provide the military support there to keep the strait open, and perhaps as a response, but I don't know enough of the details of what he's proposed yet on that.
Remembering your time as a director with Constellation, Senator, is this not an argument for nuclear, what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, you know, I think we as a country should make sure that we're over-investing on any and all kinds of energy resources, including nuclear. Yep. And, you know, if the American public are going to be the ones that really benefit when we have too much infrastructure in place and we don't have the higher utility prices that are caused by bottlenecks and lack of capacity, just like we saw in the latest heat wave that came through the Northeast, and we saw a price skyrocket on power prices. The only reason we're seeing those skyrocketing prices is because we have constrained ourselves on building infrastructure, not because there's not capital, not because there's not capability, but because we refuse to take on the permitting reform issue. And that is what's going to provide lower prices and abundant energy.
Should we be investing in wind and solar as well, Senator, or do you draw the line, for instance, on wind like the president?
No, I don't at all. I do think we need all forms of low-cost energy, but I don't believe in subsidies. I think the market is strong enough, and I think that we ought to take on all forms of energy that aren't asking for a subsidy.
Well, Senator, I'd like to ask you as well about business before you and your colleagues. As Senator Graham, of course, who we began by discussing, was the chair of the Budget Committee. The president has been pushing for a third budget reconciliation package, in part for funding the war with Iran. But he obviously also would like to see the Save America Act in some form. And many have suggested that reconciliation is the realistic path for that happening. But how realistic is budget reconciliation now, not just with Graham no longer chairing the committee, but also with just the limited legislative clock, frankly, that is left before the midterms?
Well, I think, you know, you rightfully point out, I think that that Senator Graham was a powerful force on that topic, and we will certainly miss that as we try to make progress on those objectives. So I don't think it's should surprise anybody that you take somebody that powerful out of the mix, that it'll have some impact on being able to get that done. So we'll see, though. I think Leader Thune continues to do a fantastic job. Whip Barrasso, I'm very impressed with those two individuals and the number of issues that they manage through and the complexity of the issues they manage through. And they will do their best to get those done. But I think we have to be realistic. When there's not enough votes, there's not enough votes. And I think that's, you know, something that they've been trying to communicate.
All right, Senator, it's good to have you back on Bloomberg. With his view from Oklahoma, Republican Alan Armstrong, we thank you for being with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll have more on the breaking news just happening now. CENTCOM announcing new strikes on Iran at this hour. We'll take a closer look at the impact on global energy markets as this conflict escalates. Kevin Book, Managing Director of ClearView Energy Partners, will join us ahead on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. As we turn back to the war with Iran, crude oil surging today. With the U.S. and Iran exchanging strikes, the U.S. announcing a third night of strikes just a short time ago, with CENTCOM taking to Twitter to let us know this began just about 30 minutes ago. And the president also implementing a new U.S. blockade a short time ago as well. The move sending Brent crude above $83 a barrel this evening, which combined with higher interest rates is making a tough recipe for Wall Street traders, especially on the eve of earnings reporting season. The backdrop for power moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who joins us now live from New York. Nora?
Well, a lot of red on my screen as we see the market trying to digest all of the geopolitical action that's happening in the Middle East, with Trump reinstating this blockade in Iran and demanding that 20% reimbursement on all cargo shipped through the waterway, as we know, the Strait of Hormuz. So we did see oil, of course, surging higher, but you did see a lot of pressure on the equity market as we looked at the trading day. The S&P 500 down by about 0.8%, but where we saw the most pressure was coming from tech. So we did see a risk-off mood in the market. Energy, the best performing sector in the S&P 500, no surprise there, seeing its best day since February. But we did also see bonds falling across the curve as we saw bond traders pricing in the activity as well. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lower by about 0.3%, so not as much pressure, not as much of a decline as we saw for the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100. So it held up a bit better, of course, due to the lack of mega exposure to the tech industry. The Nasdaq 100 lower by about 1.9%, just shy of a 2% drop. But back to oil, because we did see both Brent and WTI surging higher than about 9%. And we did see Brent at about $83 a barrel. I'm keeping an eye on WTI, which is hovering just about near $78 a barrel. Those U.S.-Iran tensions escalating in the headlines that we continue to see coming through, really pressuring the market. But as you mentioned earlier, Joe, bank earnings are on the mind of Wall Street right now, with Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman, a few others all expected to report tomorrow. 5 out of the 6 major banks in focus. So we'll have to see how the kickoff to earnings season goes tomorrow.
Indeed, we will. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. And joining us now for more on the oil moves we saw today specifically and how much further they could go, we turn to Kevin Book, Managing Director at ClearView Energy Partners, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Kevin, welcome back.
Good to see you.
To Bloomberg. Apparently, Congress has been notified that we are officially back at war with Iran. The blockade is set to go into effect at 4 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. And it's not just Iranian cargo that is going to be blockaded. Any cargo passing through the Strait, President Trump says, will have to pay a 20% fee to the United States. What does this all mean for the realistic flows of energy we can expect out of this region?
I think the market optimistically looked at the reopening as if it was going to stay open. And the question was, what were the instabilities that could come? This is one of them. Both sides arguing about who controls the Strait, a return to active combat, damage to facilities in Kuwait, production facilities, a sign of what could come with further escalation. But just shutting down the Iranian outflows and then potentially Iran stopping other outflows because they're either looking at the risk and deciding not to go through the Strait or because they've been impaired by ordnance. All this means that we're headed higher. And if you look at a $10 move and you ask what's being priced in, it's a lot more than just those Iranian barrels being stopped.
Wow. Yeah, it was a remarkable move. It's still going. If you see 83 for Brent is really something. Axios, by the way, just reporting now, CENTCOM has plans for multiple days of strikes on Iran. So if the market got a little bit over its skis on the optimism front, could we see the same overreaction in the other direction? Could we go back to $120 or test those highs?
Well, it would take a lot for that, and maybe we'll see what that looks like as active combat resumes, if it does. Right now, there are a lot of inventories that have been depleted deeply.
Yes.
They haven't yet been restocked. On the other hand, a lot of trapped tankers have left the Strait. And so if you look at CENTCOM's own number of more than 400 million barrels of what might have been 600 to 700 million that had been sort of missing from the market, that's a substantial restoration. It might take a while to burn off.
Okay.
Well, yeah, it was just last week that we were having a conversation around an oversupply.
Exactly.
All of the sudden. So I just wonder where you realistically think the balance of supply and demand might shake out in the short term. If we do see a restriction in flows from the Strait of Hormuz, but there are still stockpiles to lean on, and a lot already got out prior to the resumption of hostilities.
Kayleigh, duration is destiny. So if this is a one-week interlude to an otherwise sort of progressive ceasefire process, then I don't think we'll be having that conversation about $120 a barrel anytime soon. But if we start to see damage to civilian infrastructure, retaliation against regional production going beyond some of the incidental or smaller types of strikes that we've seen more recently, and then we have questions about what happens after that, more mines in the Strait, more interruption of throughput, more concern about travel, then, yeah, I think we have a different conversation.
We spoke a short time ago with Senator Alan Armstrong, who I think you know well from industry. He worked at Williams for a number of years, ran that company, was a director at Constellation. We talked about the idea of pipelining around the Strait. If we're in a world where the Strait can be closed at any time by Iran, if that's going to be the long-term result of this conflict, how can we use technology to make the Strait irrelevant?
Well, so there's two things that are going on at once. One is that sort of diversification of sources and routes, which we usually talk about in the context of demand-side responses to an interruption like this one. But on the supply side, diversifying your route to market is also important. And that's why the Saudis did it after the tanker war in the 1980s. And so I think you can expect to see some of that. The other side of that, though, is that there's a sort of zero-sum character to energy dominance 2.0. And one of the implications is that the Western Hemisphere can be a source of supply. If the Strait becomes problematic, if the Persian Gulf becomes risky, if long-term capital investments look like they come with a durable risk premium, what does that do to the shift in where the world will be getting its oil? Right now, it seems a bit ridiculous to talk about that because the Middle East is where the molecules are. But there's a lot of molecules in the Western Hemisphere, too.
Well, and in Russia, though, of course, because of the war in Ukraine, a lot of sources have tried to wean themselves off of Russia in particular. And now there's a conversation happening on Capitol Hill about quite quickly passing tighter sanctions on Russia in honor of a man who was shepherding those through, the late Senator Lindsey Graham. If we do see a tightening of the screws on Russia, what does that mean for energy markets if there are, for example, secondary sanctions on buyers of Russian crude?
Or secondary tariffs.
Or that, yes.
And so, Kayleigh, I think much depends on the character of the new draft that we haven't yet seen. The original draft was a mandate. It imposed those tariffs. Section 17 of the Sanctioning Russia Act said that Congress, or that the president shall, if triggered, impose 500% tariffs on buyers of Russian energy. I think that the new version might be more of an option than an obligation. And so the market impact would really revolve around presidential choice. What do we know from what the president chose when he had IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as his tool for secondary tariffs? He used them selectively. And so it's not a guarantee. It's not a mandate the same way the original version of the text might be. We'll see what the language says before I think we get a sense of what the market impacts might be.
All right, we'll come back when we have that language and we'll reassess with Kevin Book. Thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, how Washington is trying to stop China from training its AI on U.S. models. We'll bring you that exclusive Bloomberg reporting up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kayleigh Lyons. Tonight, Washington is looking to take steps against China in its continued push to train its own artificial intelligence off of U.S. models, with U.S. labs now accusing Chinese companies of logging queries and responses entered into language models like that of Anthropic in an effort to use that data to instruct its own AI models, going around prohibitions put in place. For more on what's being dubbed adversarial distillation, we're joined by Bloomberg's Maggie Eastland. So, Maggie, first, talk to us about what this distillation process is and how worried these AI labs are about it. They're describing this as an existential risk, effectively.
Exactly, Kaylee. The AI companies, Anthropic and OpenAI, have described this as a key risk, and they've identified several of their Chinese competitors. Most recently, Anthropic accused Alibaba of using this technique. Now, it's a bit of a strange name, right? Distillation. It's kind of confusing and hard to understand, but essentially what it is a user, typically in China, is what the companies are alleging, will ask the AI model a ton of questions. And it turns out that may be all that's needed to essentially reverse engineer some of the key capabilities of these models.
Interesting. All right. So now that we know what distillation is, and I'm slow, what do you do following that process to actually glean information from it? How do you get to the end results?
Yeah, so you would essentially feed that data into another round of AI training. And this kind of, the AI companies say it allows China to sort of shortcut the process. And the concern is a bit financial as well, because this means that Chinese companies can make products that are almost as good as the U.S. versions and sell them at much cheaper cost. So U.S. officials have estimated that it's costing AI labs around $6 billion in income per year. Wow. So not revenue, income.
Wow.
And how do you stop it? What can be done to address that?
It's a very thorny issue. It's hard to stop because it's all just based on use, right? So all a Chinese user needs is essentially access to kind of like an API credential. It's similar to sharing a Netflix password. So it's been quite hard to stop, but the early efforts, the White House is joining in on some information sharing, and the labs are hoping to get some antitrust kind of protections. They could share more information with each other.
Even Netflix figured out how to get around the password thing. Maggie, thank you, and congrats on the scoop. Bloomberg's Maggie Eastland with important reporting you can find on the terminal and online. Now, the UN Security Council has convened a special session. This happened just a short time ago, following an escalation in the war between the U.S. and Iran, a war that continues tonight, after the president promised to hit Iran, quote, very hard. If you're just joining us, you should know. CENTCOM then announced this hour strikes have already begun. The Deputy UN Ambassador Tammy Bruce speaking against the regime during that UN Security Council session earlier. Listen.
Once again, this council is called into an emergency session to discuss the Iranian regime's efforts to threaten its neighbors in the Gulf and undermine efforts toward peace in the region. Beyond the maritime space, in the past week, Iran has launched UAVs and missiles against Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE.
So let's get into this now with Heather Conley, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. It's always great to have you with us. Heather, we're back to square one here, it seems. What is the Pentagon going through right now in terms of options when it comes to targeting, knowing that we've been here before?
Well, Joe, I think we have to focus on the objective, which is the Strait of Hormuz, and trying to make sure that Iran can't control it. So what you've seen over the last 3 days have been attacks on their coastal installations, fast boats, the drones, their missiles that could attack those shipping structures. This is very similar to what we've seen a few months ago. They're going back over some of the same targeting packages, and you're also seeing, Iran still retains that capability. So there's been some reconstitution on the Iranian military part as well.
Despite repeatedly the president saying that these capabilities had effectively been eradicated by the first round of Operation Epic Fury. So how long would you realistically expect, Heather, for this to last? Because the first go around, we were hearing language from the White House that it was going to be 4 to 6 weeks, and then perhaps just a few weeks after that. It seems that, at least for right now, it's open-ended, that there is no end in sight.
So we know the White House has notified Congress about this latest attack. So the 60-day clock begins. We know the White House does not want Congress to weigh in on authorization of use of military force. So I can't give you a timeline, but that's a 60-day and early September clock where I think they will not want to have anything impact their operations. Again, I think we will continue to see this tit for tat until, again, like the last time, then there'll be some peace effort to try to stabilize, and we're going to go around this ring over and over again. Both sides can't accomplish its mission fully which is control of the strait, unless you would see the U.S. put a substantial military package that would basically truly seize the strait, which I think is a bigger operational package than we have right now in the Gulf.
In the meantime, the administration has set the precedent now of starting and stopping the clock on this, so we could go 59 days tell Congress we're no longer at war, and the war powers conversation has changed quite a bit. But I'm looking at these CENTCOM videos that we're playing while you're speaking, Heather. Cruise missiles coming off of ships, air-to-ground missiles being shot by very expensive fighter jets. The conversation leading up to this point was, how do we replace all of these munitions? We're about to blow up a lot more stuff here. To what extent are we capable of continuing this operation while also being able to wage another war if it were necessary?
So, Joe, this is exactly where my concerns are, our munition stockpiles. I mean, again, we go back to last year in the 12-day war, how much munition stocks we've used. Yeah. And you're right, this sustainment, again, we've had a pretty robust naval posture for months in the Gulf. Mm-hmm. You need to resupply those vessels. You need to relieve those crews. You need to relieve those ships. The missile use, the high-end particular, they have long production lead times. So it is something we have to watch very carefully. These stocks are going to start getting into critical thresholds here, and it just takes us so long to produce them. The Defense Production Act has been put into place. We have those means, but I think it's going to take a while, and it will start affecting long-term operations for sure.
Wow. Well, and that's just, of course, the U.S.'s ability to posture offensively and defensively. What of the other Gulf states? What of Israel? Because I highly doubt, Heather, that this will stay limited to just the U.S. and Iran if it follows the pattern that it did in the first go-round.
Well, and we've just seen over the last 48 hours hitting Jordan for the first time. And you're absolutely right. This is where those air defense capabilities are so important, and they are so stretched. We don't have as much Patriots, again, Ukraine, and needing to help them with air defenses. So our allies are looking elsewhere for those types of production capabilities. But you're right, we are spread thin. Our Gulf allies need additional resources. Again, we just saw today Saudi's attack on Yemen. They also are using offensive capabilities as well as defensive. And again, keep our eyes on multiple theaters. We have a China definitely challenging in the maritime space on the first island chain. Yeah. We see the needs for Ukraine to air defenses in particular. So everybody's stretched right now.
Boy, isn't that right? As we're talking about Ukraine, it does appear that now that the president is supporting a Russia sanctions bill crafted largely by Lindsey Graham, that this is going to see the light of day. What would be its impact on the war?
Yeah, I think this would be substantial. Absolutely, this has been so long, and it is such a tribute to Senator Graham, and I feel very confident that it will pass. The question is, how will the White House use it? In that language, it was watered down. The president has lots of notwithstanding authority, meaning he doesn't have to use it. But this is a huge hit. I mean, it will whammy the Russians while their economy is now really feeling what the Ukrainians call the long-term sanctions. I mean, the fuel lines are very long. The Russian economy is shaking. The Russians will persevere, though. I think that's the challenge here. But if that is put into place, the Russians are really going to feel it. It will have a big effect, and I'm glad the president continues to be supportive of President Zelensky. It was a good outcome at the NATO meeting. The Europeans are stepping up today hugely on air defense capabilities. So some positive news, but it will get worse before it gets better, I fear.
Yep, of course, President Zelensky met with Senator Graham in Kyiv this weekend just before his death. Heather Conley, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, the flags on the Capitol are flying at half-staff as the district mourns the loss of Senator Lindsey Graham. We'll hear more about how senators are reacting and speak to those who have worked with him next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's difficult to believe that Lindsey Graham is no longer here with us, that we won't run into him at a media day or share a joke with him at this afternoon's vote. The halls of the Senate already feel empty without him. And I know I'm not alone in that feeling. He was a friend to so many of us on both sides of the aisle. And I know that I'm not the only one who finds it difficult to imagine the Senate without Lindsey Graham.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was Senate Majority Leader John Thune giving a heartfelt speech about his late colleague, Senator Lindsey Graham, following Graham's sudden death this weekend. The flags at the Capitol now at half-staff in his honor. And joining us now from Capitol Hill is someone who covered Senator Graham for years, Bloomberg's Steve Dennis. So, Steve, as we heard there from Leader Thune, it's obviously a massive hole that Senator Graham leaves behind. And we now know officially that Governor McMaster in South Carolina has appointed Graham's sister to serve as caretaker. Talk to us more about the role that she will be stepping into in the shoes that someone eventually on a permanent basis will have to fill.
Yeah, I think his sister Darlene will be coming into his shoes with a ton of goodwill and people on both sides of the aisle wishing her well. But the Senate's not going to be the same. There was no senator like Lindsey Graham who could be at home on either side of the aisle cutting deals, going on codels, trying to rally support for all sorts of legislative causes, from immigration reform to support for Ukraine, which of course was his last major initiative. And even now there are a lot of senators, and it sounds like the White House is now on board with passing his proposal for a sanctions package on Russia and Russia's allies who buy their oil. And that would be, in the words of John Thune, sort of a fitting tribute. It sort of remains to be seen how fast that can come together. We still need to see text, et cetera. But, right now there's just a lot of senators I'm talking to in the hallways are still sort of in shock, and they don't really know what's going to happen next.
Yeah. Just as a matter of practicality, Stephen, a few things are going to happen. It looks like Senator Ron Johnson will be next in line to run the Budget Committee. He'll be holding the gavel that Lindsey Graham held. And I'm just curious what this means for the supplemental budget request for Iran. This was something that Graham was helping to push through.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a real challenge. Senators were telling us in the hallway that it's going to be very difficult to do a reconciliation package with only Republicans. It's also hard to imagine getting a deal with Democrats on anything that funds the war. And yet the war is back on. So the pressure to fund it is going to be back on too, as well as Democrats planning more votes to end the war. And so I think this is just going to be a very intense time. They have about a month until the August recess. The war is back center stage. And Lindsey Graham was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, cheerleader for taking on Iran. So it's just going to be a challenge to see who steps into these various roles. Ron Johnson is known as more of a deficit hawk on that, on that gavel. So we'll see. Does he push for more offsets, more spending cuts to pay for the defense increase, and can they get the votes for these things? All this is going to be challenging. We have Todd Blanche's big hearing in the Judiciary Committee coming up later this week. He is, kind of on the bubble here. Tom Tillis, John Cornyn, not running for re-election, have not been on board yet with endorsing him. And so there's going to, Lindsey Graham was the kind of guy on the Judiciary Committee who you'd want there as an ally. Now there's a hole in that spot. So there's just so many different issues where Lindsey played a major role, and now it's time for somebody else to step up if they can.
Stephen, we appreciate your spending some time with us this evening. Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis with us live from Capitol Hill. As we turn now to our political panel, Democratic strategist Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, is with us, alongside Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, I'll start with you because you were, of course, very close to Lindsey Graham, and your experiences together, if our audience isn't familiar, is by way of your long career working with John McCain, the three amigos. It was McCain, Graham, Joe Lieberman. Before we get to all the policy and all the rest, you traveled the world with these guys, and you knew Lindsey Graham on a level that most Americans would never have the opportunity. I'm just wondering what your thought is on the loss and what it means for this Congress.
Yeah, we just heard a great report about what a loss he is for the Senate.
Yeah.
And, of course, his leadership there has been really important for the Republican caucus. And really what a lot of people don't realize is just how incredibly important he was to the country as one of the representatives we have who've spent time in some of the most dangerous parts of the world building relationships and trying to promote American interests and values around the world, whether it's in Eastern Europe or Asia or in the Middle East, both on the side of the Gulf states, but also on the greatest supporter of Israel. And in Latin America, I mean, Lindsey traveled every weekend, and he had the kind of support back home that he could afford that, right? I mean, he was in the NATO meetings and then spent the balance of the weekend in Ukraine while running for re-election. There are very few senators who have that kind of option value. And he not only knew the issues around the globe, but he knew the leaders in our counterparts around the globe. And that relationship is what enabled him to broker so many important deals for the country for so long. And I think that aspect of it, I know there are a lot of, troubled democracies around the world now who are going to really wish Lindsey Graham was there to help them today.
Well, and as Rick is aptly speaking to, Jeannie, this is probably not just a loss for the United States and for our president, who was very close with Lindsey Graham, but for the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was with him this weekend, for Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel.
That's right. And both of them have spoken out very eloquently since his passing about how much he meant to them, how much his work meant to their countries. He visited Ukraine 10 times since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it's quite astonishing. And of course, you had Benjamin Netanyahu following President Trump on Meet the Press this weekend, talking very eloquently about how much Lindsey Graham meant to him personally, but again, more importantly, how much he meant to the country of Israel as he worked with him to try to forward these shared agreements they had or shared vision they had. And, I think one thing that somebody just reminded me, Senator Kennedy, John Kennedy, who just wrote a book not that long ago, talked about Lindsey Graham in his book a little bit. And he said Lindsey Graham's motto about anything he cared about was don't be part of the problem, be the whole problem. And I think, as you look at these issues and we talk about Graham as sort of a shapeshifter, when it came to things he cared about, he wanted to be the whole problem and he wanted to push forward a solution that he firmly believed in.
We'd like to ask you about the process to replace him, Rick. Now that Darlene Graham Nardone is in place as a caretaker, there will be an election. We have primary dates lined up, of course, and how this is going to work in a pretty short period of time. I think back to Lindsey Graham as an impeachment manager in the House of Representatives, a very different politician than the one you were just describing. How do you get from that place in Washington politics to being considered an elder statesman?
Well, we recruited Lindsey Graham in 1999 to be on the McCain campaign for president in 2000, and he was a House member. He and Mark Sanford from South Carolina. We knew South Carolina would be important if we ever got through New Hampshire. That worked pretty well. But he immediately became enthralled with presidential politics. He was just a second-term House member, but he was from an important state, and he immediately latched hold of John McCain and the apparatus. He wanted to learn more and get around. He wanted to see all these states. He'd never really traveled that much outside of South Carolina, and he became, really curious about the whole process and the people in these states. He built relationships. And he never stopped there, right? He just used that experience to then, start, building the same kind of relationships, not just within the United States, but outside, as we've talked about. So I think his intellectual curiosity met the moment. There was so many things changing in our country, between 2000 and today, 25 years later, that he wanted to be a part of all that. And he had the kind of intellectual capacity to absorb it and make good use of it. And that's not for everybody.
Well, and of course, as you talk about how many people he got to know and the relationships that he built, he had a very close relationship with President Trump. They golfed together. Jeannie Graham, in the aftermath of his sudden passing, has been described as the Senate liaison to this White House. In fact, they spoke on the phone just hours before Graham died, and President Trump said one of the things they talked about was the Save America Act. Whether it is that specific piece of legislation or, frankly, anything else that the Senate has to take up now, how much more difficult is that job without Lindsey Graham there to shepherd things along?
Yeah, Kayleigh, I think it's going to be much more difficult. You know, one term I keep hearing is people calling Lindsey Graham the Trump whisperer and being the go-between between the president, the administration, and the Senate. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I thought Steve did a great job summarizing some of the challenges here. I mean, as chair of budget, he was committed to this reconciliation bill, to moving it forward. And he will be replaced by Ron Johnson, who just a few months ago told the Wall Street Journal that, you know, you guys, meaning the Journal, seem to support the president's defense spending proposals. It's not going to happen. You know, as much as we call Graham a foreign policy hawk, Ron Johnson, by comparison, is a fiscal hawk. What are the offsets going to be for that? And not only are we, you know, dealing with paying for what's already happened over in Iran, but heating up again there. And then you look at these people who are going through, particularly the Judiciary Committee and Todd Blanche. He is going to have some challenges now. You've got Tom Tillis, you've got John Cornyn. They are not particularly supportive, and Lindsey Graham would have been able to speak their language and help push potentially Todd Blanche through. And this is coupled with today the decision by the judge really banging Todd Blanche over this IRS agreement with Trump. All of this happening just this week in Congress, and that is going to really be felt by this White House with Lindsey Graham's absence.
This is going to be quite a week for testimony. Rick, the filing period for the new primary opens July 21, lasts a week. Special primary August 11th, and there'll be a runoff if needed. Short list seems pretty consistent, and Lieutenant Governor Pamela Yvette seems to be at the top of all of them. Is that how you're looking at this?
Yeah, she ran a good campaign for governor and was a favorite of Henry McMaster, the governor. Yep. He endorsed her for that role. She comported herself well. She had a lot of goodwill and still a little bit of remaining money and staff. So she, I think, starts well ahead of everybody else. I know there's some outsiders. I think Mark Lynch, businessman, has thrown his hat into the ring already. He's kind of a new threat to that scale. But the reality is that, you know, they're very buttoned up in South Carolina. So this cycle of like every week for the next 3 weeks, there's going to be some kind of form of commitment and then election and then runoff. Is very well structured and meant to get to a decision quick. So people like Lieutenant Governor Yvette have really got a leg up because name ID, money, supporters, she's ready to go.
All right. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you so much for your reflections tonight. We appreciate it, as always. And, of course, tonight we, of course, have been dealing with the breaking news that the U.S. once again is striking Iran. President Trump is speaking right now with reporters in the Oval Office, confirming that the U.S. is attacking Iran tonight. He says that we're taking out Iran's capability related to the Hormuz Strait. And he says, in the end, we'll control the whole thing, suggesting the U.S. will end up controlling the Strait of Hormuz. We'll have more coverage of that, of course, tomorrow right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.